Hello and welcome everyone to the DoD EDIS Early Intervention webinar series. My name is Jane Dooley and I'm the technical host. And before I turn it over to Dr. Youngren, just wanted to go over a few brief housekeeping items. In addition to viewing the presentation on your screen, a copy of the slide deck has also been emailed out to everyone. All I have in terms of housekeeping, I need to read this quick disclaimer for you. The appearance of hyperlinks does not constitute endorsement by the Department of Defense of this website or the information, products, or services contained therein for other than authorized activities such as military exchanges and morale, welfare, and recreation sites. The Department of Defense does not exercise any editorial control over the information you may find at these locations. Such links are provided consistent with the stated purpose of this DoD-sponsored webinar. So that's what I had in terms of housekeeping, and I think Dr. Youngren has a few points of her own that she'd like to share, so I'll turn it over to you, Naomi.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. And welcome, everybody, to, as Jane mentioned, this is the fourth in our 7-part webinar series on the Tri-Service IFSP. Just as a reminder, this will be our last Tri-Service webinar before the holidays, and then we were going to be following up with the webinars, finishing up with the webinars in January, starting on the 7th and then again on the 9th of January. So please check your schedule for those upcoming webinars after this one, and I definitely want to make a point to wish everybody happy holidays. But before that, let's go ahead and get started. As you likely recall, the webinar topics are linked to sections of the IFSPD Process Guidance Handbook, which you all should have a copy of. If you do not, you can download it here on the webinar or contact me and I'll make sure that you get a copy of that. Today we're here at webinar 4. There it is. Webinar 4, learning more about family concerns, priorities, and resources. The objectives for today's webinar are to review standardized ways to learn about family and child strengths and resources. This information is going to include looking at eco-maps, as well as delving a little bit into the routines-based interview process. I'm excited to have a few of our EDIS colleagues participating to share their experiences, and I certainly invite others to chime in as well. If you do happen to be following along with the IFSP Guidance Handbook, we are covering pages 31 through 43. Moving along this linked process that we've been talking about, today we're at the RBI and moving forward with the IFSP completion. We're on page 6 of the IFSP PD, which is the documentation for all steps in the early intervention journey, beginning with that referral. So to this point in the IFSPD or IFSP process document, it will include documentation of the referral, the screening, evaluation, and eligibility. Again, it's referred to as the IFSPD process document because it documents all the steps in the process, minimizing the need for separate reports and documentation, recognizing, of course, that there are a couple of extra forms, such as the entry and entitlement and permission. So this is where we're at today, RBI and IFSP. We're going to talk a little bit more about these steps in our linked process. When it comes to asking about family and child strengths and resources, it's certainly important to help families understand why we want to know this information. And I would go on and say even further, it's important that we all have a good understanding of the purpose behind every question and every element of the IFSP. What we don't want is the form just to be completed in a perfunctory manner of, oh, we need to complete this because it's on the form, that type of thing. But just like we want to know why everything is included and why this information is useful, we want to help families to know that as well. The IFSP does have a brief statement included in it that can be used as a conversation starter in gathering this information. And it reads, early intervention focuses on helping you help your child develop during your day-to-day routines and activities with your family. To understand how we may be able to help you, we would like to learn a little bit more about your family strengths and resources. The information that you choose to share is voluntary. At this point in time of gathering information about family strengths and resources, it's another good point to highlight their rights and reinforce that all information that is gathered is maintained confidentially, and of course that they are collaborative partners in each step of the process. So throughout the process, we invite families to share what it is that they like to share. At this part in the discussion about strengths and resources, it's also a good time to highlight the family indicators that are used to measure the results of early intervention for families participating. We want families to know the intended outcomes for early intervention. These are the indicators that are measured as part of the national initiative to measure results for early intervention for children and families. The national family outcomes are listed here, and they also include how early intervention has helped families to know their rights, effectively communicate their child's needs, and help their child develop and learn. We're going to discuss the national child and family outcome measures more in subsequent webinars, but I do want to encourage you to review the discussion and resources that are available, and I'm going to type here in the chat box a URL where you can contact the Early Childhood Outcomes Center. It's now part of the ECPA Center. So there's the URL in the chat box there that you can access. Again, I want to highlight that when we talk about measuring child and family outcomes, we've really integrated that into the IFSP process. So this is another point to talk a little bit about family outcomes. Shown here is a condensed version of page 6 of the IFSP. The major questions are included to learn about family strengths and resources, and certainly gathering information about family interests, as you well know, facilitates an understanding of the family and possible cultural and community influences. Knowing families' interests also is going to shed light on the activities that the family finds enjoyable and consequently makes time for. And as you know and have probably experienced with many of the families that you've worked with, that these activities really do serve as valuable opportunities for learning, and also there are several different opportunities for embedding intervention strategies within those things that families are already doing and already have in place. At this point in the process, it's not necessary to go into great detail, as that will be doing a little bit more during the routine-based interview, but having this initial preliminary information. I just read the chat. Lisa Clifton, you are absolutely right. The N is missing. Let me try that again. It's www.ectacenter, which has an N, center.org/ECO. Thanks for your attention to detail. So the second URL should be the right one. Thank you for that. Back to this section 6 of the IFSP. It starts off on a positive note. It starts off asking what's your child really good at doing. Again, it's a big open-ended question that allows family to take you to the information that they choose to share. So this is a good opportunity to get started there. The next bit of the IFSP, which doesn't look so big on the screen here, but when you look at the actual form, you'll see that it's a bigger space. There's a larger space there to discuss who makes up the family and what resources and connections that they have in place. The space is large enough for an eco-map, but could also be completed by writing the information in paragraph style. And we're going to talk about the eco-map in just a second, and Tina is going to share with us a little bit more about an eco-map that they've recently developed. The remaining sections on this page are going to gather information about resources that may be needed by the family. It addresses cultural question, upcoming deployments or schools, or other kinds of family separations. I do want to make a note here at the bottom of the page. It draws reference to completing the child and family routines activities worksheet. Here, I haven't quite mastered this arrow thing yet. It stumps me every time. But I figure maybe through repetition I'll actually be able to learn how to use it. All right, maybe not. At the bottom, it says you'll also complete the form about child and family routines and activities. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's essentially the documentation for the routine-based interview. But first, let's talk a little bit more. Those are the questions that we just highlighted. And at the bottom there is the deployment in school. And then at the bottom of that one is where you'll see reference to the worksheet. So let's move on to the eco-map. As you well know, early intervention involves activating a system of supports that help families help their children grow and learn. And to do this, we need to understand more about families' existing supports. The eco-map is really a visual illustration of who's in the family and what types of supports and resources they have, what kinds of connections they have with community. And when I say community, it might be far-reaching community. It might be I'm in contact with my parents via Skype or some other mechanism. We oftentimes will see that for families that are living overseas or are living in communities farther away from their extended family. The EcoMap template can be used for developing and organizing the EcoMap. It is an alternative to writing a paragraph in this section of the IFSP, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this here in just a sec. But before we do that, I'm going to open up a poll question. I'm curious how many of you have completed an EcoMap. Your options are yes, once or twice, B, several times, C, no, and D, not really sure. All right. Looks like we've got kind of a mix of experience with doing the EcoMap. Some once or twice, a few more that have done it several times, and a couple of, and then several people that have said no, they haven't. Again, the IFSP handbook does provide more detail about EcoMaps. There's also quite a bit of research and information about EcoMaps that you can search through if you have medical library resources, or also through my favorite, Google. There's a lot of information that's out there with EcoMaps. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those here. Okay, thank you. Moving along, I want to share another resource, and this resource didn't make it out with the email that you just got recently with the slide deck for today, but it is downloadable here.
Actually, Dr. Youngren, I did just send that out. So I did just send out a new email with that included in the attachment, and I did upload it to the file share on the right-hand side. So it's up there as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so very much. So this is a worksheet. Again, it's just a worksheet. It's not something that has to be completed, but some folks have found this useful as a way to complete the EcoMap. So starting here in the middle, who lives at home, and then asking about extended family on the mother or father's side. As you well know, sometimes we have extended family beyond that. You know, maybe it's a blended family or that type of thing. It asks about friends, it asks about community supports, organization services, and any kind of work connections there. So again, this is just a resource. Again, I share with you because some people have found it helpful in developing EcoMaps. In thinking about developing EcoMaps, I'd like to open up another poll question. When thinking about questions that you might ask to learn about family support, which of these questions do you think you might ask? And you can choose as many as you like. Okay, looks like several people have chosen A through E, which is certainly accurate. Any one of these or all of these might be used, might be asked in discovering about family support. And there are likely a host of other ones that you all might use, or you have some favorites. I will invite you now to enter into the chat. If there are some other questions that you ask to discover about family support that you really like to ask, please take a moment to share those in the chat box so that the rest of us can learn from your experiences as well. At this point, I am excited to turn it over to my colleague, Tina, who's going to share a little bit more with you about their expertise and experience with developing the EcoMap that you see here on the screen. So Tina, are you ready to star 2 and unmute your phone?
I believe I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just need you, can you speak up a little bit?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. I hope everybody else can hear you.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh, that's better. Better volume. Thank
okay,
you.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Naomi.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think that most of us here at Vilseck do use the EcoMap as opposed to using the narrative when we're looking at the family strengths and resources. This particular one is a prototype of one that Amanda and I did, and we used it actually to launch the RBI, and we found that this really seems to work pretty well. It provides us with a kind of a simple and concrete way to start talking about the family in general, and then it kind of sets up the tone for the RBI. I think one of the first and I think one of the most important things to me is it really kind of lets the family know that we're genuinely interested and want to know about them. I think people aren't really used to that, so it kind of sets that tone. Another purpose I see the EcoMap serving, it kind of bridges the gap between sharing that more routine kind of information to sharing more personal and intimate sort of information. And thirdly, I think it gives a nice preview of the kind of detail that we're going to be sharing during the RBI. So it's a nice way, I think, to kind of ease into that. And as you're drawing the eco map in front of the family, it gives them a chance to actually see the structures they have in place, their support system. And it also kind of lets them stop you and tell you if you're on target or not with what you're drawing, and so you can have a chance to kind of dialogue about that. For some reason, this little house icon seems to personalize the eco map a little bit. Families have made some comments about that. I think it turns it into more, it's a more personal thing. It's not just a diagram, but it's about their family and their surrounding support system. And you'll notice on this one we used varying thicknesses of lines to kind of indicate where there's really strong bonds or where the relationships are not quite as strong, and gives just a really nice overall picture. One of the things we talk a lot about is in EDIS is that adult learning style, and Amanda and I, as we were talking, we were saying how we feel this really helps a lot more parents with, especially the visual learners, to kind of process the information and be able to look and see what's going on in their lives. As far as other benefits we've seen or how the eco map can be helpful to parents, this particular one, when we started out, the mom was pretty sure she was all alone, had no support. And by the end of working through this eco map, she realized that she did indeed have a lot of support. And even though a lot of it was not local, she felt much less isolated by the end of working through this eco map. And I think, on the other hand, I've seen some families who, after completing it, realized that they would like more support in their lives, and then that can go on to become a family outcome if they would like. Lastly, I've also seen some families where you notice there's not many supports, and they're perfectly fine with that. And I think that's good for us to realize that they may be very content, and it keeps us from encouraging them to be involved in things they're really not interested in. I think just overall, too, the eco map gives a good picture of the supports that are in place and or the supports that may be needed by a family, and gives the family just an opportunity to be reflective about their strengths and resources. And that's all I've got.
Oh, thank you so much, Tina. I think your point that you made about, all of the points, but that whole notion of looking at an eco map and somebody thinking, oh, wow, there's not much there, that reinforcement that you certainly made was, it's the family's eco map. It's not what we think it should be, it's theirs. And to ask them what they think about it after it's developed is a great way for them to reflect and to take a look at it and let you know if there's things that they'd like added or things that they wonder about.
Yes, exactly.
I'm curious, Jennifer from Benning. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to take just a second here and read your chat. Oh, okay. These are other additional questions that you asked. Super. Thank you so much for sharing. And as we develop the questions and answers and share resources, we're certainly going to share the additional nuggets of things that people have contributed as well. There was a question also in the chat about the eco map and including it on the IFSP. Certainly, there is space for it on the IFSP. However, if that's not done, you can either redraw it if it's done on another page, if you choose to do that, or it could be synthesized in paragraph form. So before moving on, any other questions or thoughts about the eco map, or questions that you might have for Tina and the illustration of one of their more recently completed eco maps? Okay, again, thank you so very much, Tina, for sharing this. All right, I'm going to move on. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the routine-based interview. It was developed by Dr. Robin McWilliam and is an integrated part of the IFSP process. Teams complete the RBI as part of each initial and annual IFSP for families that are eligible and do choose to participate in early intervention services. Understanding the child in the context of the family's life really does facilitate that holistic picture that can emphasize functionality rather than domain-specific areas of deficit. As a result, what ends up happening is outcomes become both functional, important, and contextually possible. Discovering what is working and what is not working and what a typical day looks like for the family also facilitates that collaborative discovery of the family's concerns and what they choose to work on with early intervention. When introducing the RBI, it's also helpful to reinforce how the information will help the team to gain an understanding of the child's functional skills across family routines and activities. This information, of course, will be added to the information that has already been gathered to measure where the child is at relative to the 3 national early childhood outcomes, which are measured for all children participating in early intervention services. It's measuring these outcomes that helps the families and helps the programs and helps other stakeholders understand how children overall benefit from early intervention services. The 3 national child outcomes are indicated here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those when we talk about family and child outcomes in our subsequent webinars in January. Again, there is that URL for the ECTA Center and the Early Childhood Outcomes Center that I would encourage you to look around and take a look at those resources. So before moving on to talking about some of the key elements of the routine-based interview, I'm going to open up another poll question and ask, how many of you have completed a routine-based interview? Take a look here at the variations. There's yes, I've completed it using the McWilliam format once or twice. Yes, using the McWilliam format several times. Yes, kind of a hybrid version. That might be I ask questions about families' routines, but not exactly the structure or all of the components of the routine-based interview as developed by McWilliam. Okay, excellent. We've got some yes, we've got some no's, we've got some hybrid versions. Nobody's not sure. Okay, thank you very much for sharing. It's nice to see the variations or the numbers of folks that have used, had some experience with routine-based interview. Well, let's talk a little bit about what the routine-based interview is. It is a semi-structured interview designed to help families decide what they want to work on with early intervention. It is, in fact, a family's needs assessment, and focusing on day-to-day happenings of the family assures that the identified priorities are decided upon by the family and are consequently most meaningful to them. The RBI is a recognized tool for getting to know the family, identifying their priorities, developing functional outcomes, and it certainly is relationship building as well. And like observation, the interview should be unbiased and non-judgmental and should be conducted in a manner that yields authentic information. Really, it's done so in a conversation style. At this time, I'd like to invite a couple of early intervention providers that have had some experience in doing the routine-based interview. First, Julie, are you available on the line? I believe Julie and Chris wanted to talk a little bit about it, but let's,
I'm here.
Julie, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Can the rest of you hear, Julie?
Yep, we're good.
Okay. Good.
Okay. Okay, great, thanks. So one of the questions, Julie, was what was your initial reaction to learning about and implementing the routine-based interview?
I'll try to remember back. It was a while ago. It was about, I think it's been 7 or 8 years. And I do remember that I have to confess I was one of the people who was not particularly on board initially and resistant to adding this new kind of what felt like a really big piece to our process at that point in time. And yeah, it felt like a lot to add. I wasn't sure if, it felt like it was going to make it a lot longer process. I remember feeling kind of hesitant about it being too personal, asking too many personal questions that the parents aren't going to want to answer. And we had a lot of discussions that were in that direction at that time before we started implementing it. consistently. So, but I will say that over time, it was a process of understanding it better, understanding and experiencing the benefits of it, really experiencing the fact that we got really helpful information from those discussions with families. I will say I've not had one family in all of these years who has not wanted to participate in it. I think what's happened is that parents love to have a chance to talk about their kids. They love to have a chance to talk about themselves and their families. And, it's always stated up front that they should only share what they want to share. So I've never had anyone say that they felt like we were getting too personal, even with the couple of questions at the end that sound like they're kind of personal. People seem to really get into having this conversation about their lives. And and also it certainly provides us with much richer outcomes than we would have had we just done an eval and had test scores and we knew what skills the child wasn't necessarily doing. But parents would call, parents very often say, I want my child to talk. And at the end of the RBI, it very, very often happens that there's 5 or 6 outcomes, and most of them have nothing to do with talking. You realize that parents have other things that they would like help with, that sometimes those other areas will ultimately help with the talking. But it just becomes a much richer plan. It becomes much more meaningful to the family. And anyway, it's very hard to imagine the process without that piece. I just can't imagine it. I think that would be missing a big quality piece to what we do. Can you hear me? Are you there?
I wanted to open it up for other people. If anybody has questions that they'd like to ask Julie, or other experiences that they've had with the routine-based interview, before we move on and talk a little bit about some of the core elements of the routine-based interview.
Good. Did I get my talking points?
You did.
Good.
And as some of you are typing some additional questions, let me ask, is Chris Ashman on the line?
Oh, yes, she is.
I had asked Chris also to chime in a little bit on experience with initial reactions and learning and implementing the routine-based interviews. So Chris, well, some people are adding some questions to the chat box. Would you mind talking a little bit about your experience in learning about and implementing the routine-based interview and what you found perhaps challenging and most helpful?
I have to agree that I was surprised that how interested families were in talking about themselves. Coming into doing the routines-based interview, I kind of expected that the conversations might be short and that people might not be interested in having them at all, and that indeed has not been the case. People are very interested in sharing about their family at some length, at very helpful length. One of the things that was mentioned is they might come in and saying my child doesn't talk and come out of the routines-based interview with several outcomes. Often they're behavioral outcomes. We typically find we get behavioral outcomes that were never mentioned during the routines-based interview. Another thing that I hadn't thought about, but my partner here, Elaine, pointed out, is routines-based interview is often the time that we get outcomes for other children in the family. Even though you might say we're working with the whole family, your outcomes can address anything that any needs that your family might have, typically a parent doesn't necessarily think about outcomes for other children in the family until they get to the routines-based interview. We're big fans of it. It's been extremely helpful, and we've done it for a long time and will continue to do it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. I asked a couple of folks that I know that were involved as we got started with the routine-based interview to share a little bit about their experience. And in recognizing it, initially it is a little bit of change, but in the long run, it really is a benefit for getting at family-centered early intervention and really identifying what the family wants to work on. I see Pat Chippendale also chimed in here with agreement on the process and saying even cannot imagine doing it without the RBI now. So again, I encourage you to dialogue back and forth with other folks that are on the webinars. We really want to build some collaboration across programs. So take advantage of the opportunity to chat with other folks on the webinar about various different aspects that we're talking about as we move to this more standardized process of early intervention and IFSP development in EDIS. I'm going to move on a little bit. We're going to look at the Child and Family Routines and Activities Worksheet. Included here is this particular worksheet for documenting the RBI. I want to reinforce that this is a form that's considered a worksheet. Okay, I've said that 3 times. You get the idea. It is kept in the EDIS record with likely the evaluation and assessment protocols. It's really the means for gathering information, but it's not considered part of the finalized IFSP. So it's information that's taken from the worksheet and the associated conversation that's integrated into the IFSP. So when completing the worksheet, don't get too hung up on, we want it to be legible, of course, but it's not something that's going to need to be typed. It doesn't become a physical part of the IFSP. Here in this next illustration, I'll show you one that was recently done. It's an example. Note here that a highlighter was used to highlight the things that the interviewer heard during the interview that sounded like possible concerns with that the family raised. Again, please know that this is a notes page. Doesn't need to be typed and be a physical part of the IFSP, but rather you can kind of think of it as kind of the raw data used to assist with identifying what the family wants to work on with early intervention. And you'll see there that a lot of that penmanship is likely not legible, in part because it's my penmanship and it's not very good. But you get the idea. It looks at the routines, a bit of a description of what's happening, and then there is a rating process. I just wanted to share with you an example of what one of these might look like, recognizing, of course, that everybody's got a little bit of their own style in note writing. Let me take a moment here also to share with you some other family feedback about the routine-based interview. I'm just going to take a peek at the time. I'm not going to read through each of these, but I certainly do encourage you to take a look at. Families were asked to reflect on their experiences following conducting a routine-based interview, and from their reflections, it really became apparent that the RBI was more than just an interview about the family day-to-day happenings. For families, it can really be a rewarding and enlightening process. I think these direct quotes from families reinforce those aspects. These quotes are also included in your IFSP handbook as well. At this time, I'm going to open it up to a poll question. As we briefly talked a little bit about the routine-based interview, what are the key reasons for doing these routine-based interviews? So please select 3 here. All right, absolutely. As folks are chiming in here, we see that it's A, getting to know the family, C, it is a family needs assessment, so assessing their needs, and D, setting priorities, determining what it is that the family wants to work on with early intervention. Absolutely. And those are highlighted also on page 36 of the handbook. I'm just going to flip back here to this worksheet again. Suzanne had added to the chat box that they might not use this exact worksheet, but rather they use just a regular note page, which is totally fine. And then what they do is they use this as a cover sheet and staple their notes to the back of it. I encourage, the cover sheet is a good idea because you're going to be able to document the date, the interviewer's, the child name, and then you can just say, see attached documentation there. So thank you for that addition. All right, moving on. In addition, the RBI also helps families understand that early intervention is not child-centered therapy. It really is a support to families, to the entire family, to help build their capacity to help their children to grow and to learn. The RBI really does reinforce this whole nature of the system of supports and services. It does help us identify much more functional and much more specific outcomes. So we really have a sense of what the family wants to work on, and we're all on the same page, versus having broad or nebulous outcomes. It does allow us to collect relevant information for planning strategies by understanding what it is that happens in families' day-to-day lives. Certainly provides us a wealth of information to begin planning strategies with families. The other thing it does is it's going to augment information that we need for the child outcome summary process. By gathering information about the child's functioning across a variety of routines, we do get a much better sense of where it is that the child is functioning at relative to the 3 child outcomes across various different routines. And again, as mentioned and as highlighted by folks that contributed to their thoughts on the RBI, it does set the stage for family-centered intervention. So when we think about routines, I'm going to open up another poll question. And the question is, do all families have routines? Okay, here the vast majority certainly say that all families do have routines. Let's take a little bit closer look at routines. So what are routines? Routines are really times of day, everyday events, activities, things like that. They may not happen routinely, but in reality, it would be impossible for someone to have no routines at all. All families, for example, wake up, eat, hang out, maybe go places, children get diaper changes, they take baths, they get dressed and undressed, they interact with people and objects and various things. So these are all things that happen during the day. Routines do not have to happen at the same time or in the same sequence in order to be a routine. The examples that I just mentioned may be like little mini routines. And in our work with families, we may in fact be building upon existing routines by brainstorming with families and identifying and coming up with some ideas for helping a child to be more independent, depending upon, of course, what their IFSP outcomes are. So I think an important piece to remember is that all families do, in fact, have routines, even though they may not happen routinely or at the same time every single day. One of the things that Dr. McWilliam mentioned with talking about the routine-based interview is sometimes there is a misconception of routines needing to be, well, first we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this, and it's highly structured from one day to the next. So sometimes we talk about the routine-based interview, and we'll talk to families about, well, what happens next, talk about different times a day or things that happen, and put less of an emphasis on the actual word routine, because sometimes it can get misconceived as highly structured. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about routine-based interview logistics, and then we'll cover some key points about the routine-based interview. We'll take a quick look here. Clearly, we do not have time to review the detail and all of the nuances of the routine-based interview, but I do want to highlight some key components. Let's first take a look at when to do the RBI. Certainly, it's best to do it following eligibility. There's no need to do it prior to that if the family's not eligible, as Julie and Chris also mentioned. It does take time. There's no question of that. And if the family's not eligible, then we're likely not going down that road. However, in some instances, you might find that it is helpful to do it in conjunction with the evaluation. And this is oftentimes done if there's a really good idea that the family is eligible. For example, maybe it's biologic risk, or it could be even done as part of an annual IFSP and the child continues to be eligible. I didn't ask anybody specifically, but I'm curious if anybody has had some recent experience with doing the routine-based interview in conjunction with an evaluation, and if they would like to share just a little bit about how that went. Is the 45-day window enough time to complete the screening, evaluation, and RBI? Yes, in fact, it is. I think one of the things that we have to be aware of, and one of the things that SNP has helped us out with even, is keeping track of that 45-day timeline, and also letting the family know up front this is what our 45-day timeline is, can be helpful to ensure that the different components get scheduled, and that things can be done in a timely manner. So again, like I mentioned, sometimes doing the RBI and the evaluation simultaneously can be helpful. And there's a variety of different ways that can be done. It's most helpful if you're doing, it's easier, let me say, if you're using more of a criterion reference instrument or something that is less standardized. So for example, doing it in conjunction with the Bailey would be a bit of a challenge because the Bailey has so many highly structured items. It is possible. I've done it with the DAC, and that works nicely. I've also done it in conjunction with a criterion reference tool like the HELP. It does lend itself nicely to that. Another piece of the logistics of the routine-based interview is how long it takes. And yes, in fact, it does take a while. It is a bit of a lengthy process. It takes 90 minutes to 2 hours, depending upon what additional information it is that you're sharing with the family. However, I do want to reinforce, and I think Julie and Chris and probably several others have bits to add to that. It is time well spent. It is a great opportunity to get to know the family, to find out what they want to work on with early intervention, and it is, in fact, relationship building. A little bit on who to include. Obviously, you're going to include parents. Sometimes children spend time in other locations, like in child development centers or those types of things, and you might gather a routine-based interview with those folks as well. If they are being interviewed separately, do that first so that you can share their information with parents to allow parents to choose what it is that they want to work on. One consideration for the interviewer, and here you see this initial afterwards, MLPST, oftentimes it's encouraged that the interviewer, the person that is doing the routine-based interview, be the person that is, and here's what the initials stand for, most likely primary service provider. The reason for that is because it is very, it has a high relationship building component, so it's nice that if you've got kind of a sense of who might be the primary service provider, to go ahead and have that person be the interviewer. Other people to include, most often there's a second interviewer. This person is typically taking notes. However, they might be, something might come up where the kiddo is didn't quite take the nap that we all had anticipated, and might need some additional attention and support there. So sometimes the second interviewer gets pulled a couple of different ways. Yeah, so when it's done, oftentimes it might be, the routine-based interview might be done in conjunction with the eligibility, or the eligibility might have happened in conjunction with evaluation, and then the next visit is the routine-based interview. Again, the routine-based interview, a key purpose is to identify what it is that the family wants to work on, and it's real helpful to have that discussion and dialogue with the family, and during that meeting when the information is still fresh, it's asking the family what it is that they want to work on. I want to take a look at what that looks like here in just a minute. Here are the 6 steps that are included, and we're briefly going to go through each one of these 6 steps and talk a little bit more about each one, recognizing, of course, that we really don't have the time to delve too deeply into the routine-based interview, but just to give you a bit more of a look at each one of these key components to the routine-based interview. So let's start off with the first one, preparing families. In preparing families, you want to let families know that you're interested in learning about their priorities for their child and family. It can be introduced by saying a way to do this is about learning about what happens in their day-to-day life and what typically happens. So you want to let families know this. You also want to help families to know that it oftentimes works best if there aren't too many distractions. So we might want to find a time close to nap time, or if the kiddo attends a child care center or something like that. It's best to do that. However, I'm sure if I opened up a poll and asked how many times did you plan that and it didn't work that way, several people might say, yep, I recognize that. Sometimes, you plan for a kiddo's nap and they don't actually take a nap that day. So that does happen. Other point in preparing families is letting them know how long it takes. It typically requires about 2 hours, again, depending upon what else it is that you're completing during that time. So you want to be able to coordinate a time and a location and participation with the family. So prior to doing the RBI, these are some elements that you do want to review with the family so that you can plan and coordinate it in a way that family members can participate. Sometimes it's done after work hours when both family members, if they both work, are able to participate. The next piece to take a look at is getting started. This is when you're ready to start doing the routine-based interview. There are 6 points to remember. The first is go ahead and restate the purpose of the routine-based interview. This is really to help us learn what's important to you and to identify what you want to work on with early intervention. Another piece you want to share with families is inviting them to share what it is that they like. So it might be, please share what you like and leave out what you don't like. A third piece is to remind yourself of who all are in the family. As Tina talked about the eco map is a nice lead-in to the routine-based interview because you're going to be asking about those other people that are involved with the family. I oftentimes like to write the names of the family members down on a piece of paper so that it's kind of a key to me to remember to ask about those different individuals, especially if there's lots of kids in the family, to remember the names of all of the children. You're going to review the duration of the meeting, and you're going to try your darndest to stick to that time. Ask the family also to describe their general concerns, because what you want to make sure is that you make a point to ask about those during the daily routine. So when, like the concern about the family might have come to early intervention primarily due to concerns about their child not talking. So we want to be able to review that and address that during the conversation about day-to-day routines. And then the sixth component is to explain what the second person is going to be doing. If they're going to be taking notes, please let the family know that they're going to be taking notes and that the family will have an opportunity to review the notes afterwards. Even if that person has penmanship as bad as mine, it's good to let the family see those notes. Again, it's reinforcing that this is a transparent process and all of this information is equally open to the family, that you're equal partners in the process. All right, the next part is the structure of the routine-based interview. And with the routine-based interview as developed by Robin McWilliam, it does have a structure. Again, as we talked earlier, it is a semi-structured interview. You're going to go through each routine or time of day. Again, that discussion of routine might be better stated as we're going to go through the stuff that happens during your day, a typical day, you know, what happens first and then what happens, that type of thing. For each of the routines or each of the times of day that you're talking about, you're going to ask what the child is doing. You're going to ask what everybody else is doing. You're going to ask about, and these next three are important elements to ask about that's really going to help you to get a sense of the child's participation, his engagement in the particular activity, how independent the child is, and how the child is communicating and getting along with others. So specifically within each routine, you're going to ask about the child's engagement, independence, and social relationships. And as you think about those three national child outcomes, you'll see how they kind of parallel to these questions that we're asking about in the routine-based interview. There is a direct linkage there between the two. The other element you're going to ask about is how well of this time of day is working for the parent. So what's their satisfaction with it? And in the routine-based interview, a scale of 1 to 5 is used. Just a little key point here. When you're doing the scale of 1 to 5, be sure to review it with the family so you all know that what the 1 means and what the 5 means. I had an experience once of doing that, and the family kept rating everything as a 1, and I was thinking, wow, it sounds like it's really good. And I was using a 1 to 5 rating that was polar to what their thinking was. So just be sure that you review that with the family, that 1 to 5 rating. And as you saw on the worksheet, there's a space to generate the rating as well. The person that is doing the notes is going to write down significant information and then star those things that sound like they might be concerns to the family. At this point in time, they are not identified as the outcomes the family wants to work on. They're just starred concerns that we're going to review afterwards. Then this is the kind of the meat, the middle meat of the routine-based interview. The structure is what it is that's followed. I want to share with you some conversation starters. These are included on page 39 of the handbook. These are suggestions of the kinds of questions that providers might ask. There's no single set of questions that must be asked. As you well know, each family is unique, and their discussion and what it is that's sharing will guide some of the questions that you're asking. However, these questions do provide a starting point for an RBI and can be helpful in getting started with the routine-based interview for families. What I'd like to do now is, if you think about this middle part here, what's the child doing, what's everybody else doing, participation, engagements, and social relationships. All right, let me share with you another resource that is helpful with getting started with the routine-based interview. This is the Scale for Assessment of Family Enjoyment with Routines, developed by Stacey Scott and Robin McWilliam. It was revised. It is a great little resource for getting started. One of the cautions, though, however, with using this is that you don't want to just complete the form. So you don't want to say, oh, let's talk about wake up, let's talk about diapering and dressing. You really want to be able to follow the flow of the family's day in talking about, so tell me how your day starts and then what happens. So sometimes you have to flip around a little bit with this, but it does provide some good resources in terms of questions that you might ask around waking up. Here's a host of questions that are going to get at engagement, independence, and social relationships. The same thing here, you'll see questions that get at engagement, independence, and social relationships around diapering and dressing. So it is a good, helpful getting started tool with a routine-based interview. The caution is not to use it as a form that is completed. Let's take a moment now and open up a poll question. In terms of thinking about questions that you might ask to move the routine-based interview along, what are some questions included from the list here that you might ask? Okay, absolutely, as people are chiming in on this one. Certainly, each one of these might be asked maybe once, maybe twice, maybe several times during the routine-based interview to move it along. There was a question here about, can the SAFER be used instead of the RBI? It's not really an instead of. The SAFER really is a tool that is used to help providers with asking questions about the various different routines to get at engagement, independence, and social relationships. So it's not an either or, but it really is a tool that augments the routine-based interview. Again, a big part of the routine-based interview is this structure that's included with it. So it's a semi-structured interview that gets at those 6 components that we just talked about. And there are some other components as well that I'm going to mention here that are included with the routine-based interview. So absolutely, all of these questions might be asked to move the interview along. That 4th component of the routine-based interview is asking two broad, open, kind of big questions about the entire family. These are called the worry and change questions. These are parts of the routine-based interview. This is the 4th of the 6 parts of the routine-based interview. And sometimes the introduction to these questions might go something like, now that we've gone through your day, I'm going to ask you 2 more questions before I summarize what it is that you said. And the 2 questions that are structured, that are asked in this way is, if you could change anything, what might that be? And the next one is, when you lie awake at night worrying, what is it that you worry about? And at this point, I asked Elizabeth to talk a little bit more about asking the worry and change question. Elizabeth, are you on the line?
Elizabeth.
Oh,
can you hear me, Naomi?
Yes. So one of the questions, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Naomi.
We talked about some questions, so
right.
Some challenges. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. The first question that you asked me was, what's challenging about these questions? And I came up with a couple of things. One of the challenges might be feeling feeling uncomfortable with asking these big picture questions because you think you're being intrusive. And my response to that would be that if you remember, we talked at the beginning of the RBI, you want to make sure that you state to the family that they should share as much information as they're comfortable with. Also, this is usually your third visit or so to the home. Most likely you've been to the home to do the screening and the evaluation, so you've already begun building a relationship with the family. And also the big picture questions come at the end of the interview after they've shared their day with you. And I think that another challenge could possibly be that providers might be feeling uncomfortable thinking that the family's answers to these big picture questions might not be within, your expertise, and that it's not, your responsibility to solve or fix their concerns or their answers to these questions. And my answer to this challenge is yes, some of their answers that they give might not be within your expertise, but it's not your job to solve or fix their concerns or worries. I think what should happen is that the second person, your teammate who's acting as scribe, should note their responses as a concern so that the family has an opportunity to make the worry and or change question an outcome. And if the family chooses to make an outcome or outcomes out of the big picture questions, and the concern is something out of your expertise, then during the home visit, as part of the intervention, you can make a plan with the family to make referrals to community agencies to address their concerns, or to bring in other members of your team to help you with that.
How have families responded to these questions?
Well, Naomi, I would say that over 90% of the families are willing to share and answer these big picture questions. And, if their response is, I wouldn't change anything or I don't worry, then that's okay. I respect that. The responses that the families give are as varied as the families. The answers to their questions can range from concerns about money, their marriage, their child being in special education all of his or her life, questions about stepchildren. And the great thing is that some of these concerns can become an outcome, and sometimes they don't.
Right. I think another important piece that you hit at with this one as well is in asking these questions, we have to really be open-minded for what it is that the family chooses to share. And sometimes it might raise some feelings that you aren't quite ready for.
That's true.
The important piece, I think, with that is to respond to the family's feelings. And again, as you had mentioned, Elizabeth, is not feeling like, oh my God, I have to fix this, but to respond to their feeling, to say, oh, that really does sound troubling or worrisome or complex or complicated or whatever it might be. So to make that point of responding to feelings first and not that sense of, oh my God, how am I going to fix this?
That's right. And I think with helping in working with families down the road, these big picture questions give you a feel for where the families are. And going through their day, which is what happens during the first part of the RBI, sometimes an issue that's really pressing on a parent's mind might not come up until you ask those big picture questions. And I can't tell you how many times the family's answers to these questions actually end up being outcome number one. And so if you didn't ask those questions, you wouldn't have the outcome. And also if the family's immediate pressing needs aren't met, then how effective can the rest of the intervention be?
Absolutely. Elizabeth, I'm reminded of an RBI that we had done, and the family had raised a question about the mother had some health issues, and I believe the father was deployed. She had concerns about feeling safe. They had lived in Germany, and they were living on the economy. And I recall that the top priority, as a result of asking that question, was that the family really wanted to move on base. And I think that reinforces what you had said about asking that family and understanding those big picture situations that, again, may become outcomes, they may not. But I think in that particular case, as a specific example, that as you worked with the family, you were able to help that actually happen so that the family wasn't worried about safety issues that were likely stemmed from some past experiences that they had where they had lived in the States.
Right. I remember that as well, and that happens all the time, that becomes the number one outcome.
So I guess, and I know folks have, when we had started this, and certainly as Robin has done training and through the routine-based interview institute, folks sometimes are a little leery, and I would just encourage you to ask the questions very open-mindedly, just the way they're stated here, and be open to what it is that the family chooses to share. Again, keeping in mind the idea of acknowledging feelings first.
Yes, and also knowing that we're not trying to fix everything.
Right. Right. That there are a lot of other community agencies and resources that we might connect the family with. Absolutely.
That's right.
Okay, I'm looking at the clock, and I'm going to move on a little bit. We've got just a bit more to talk about with some key aspects of the routine-based interview. The fifth part is the recap, and the recap might go something along these lines. I'm going to go through my notes and remind you of the concerns that you had mentioned. After this, I'm going to ask you, out of these things or anything else, what is it that you'd like to work on with early intervention? So this might be one way to introduce the recap. A couple of things with the recap is you want to do the recap around the routines. So the recap might sound something like this. This is just a little snippet of it. During diapering time, you mentioned that it's hard to keep Kendra still. It's to change her. Then we talked about meal times and that Kendra's a messy eater and mostly uses her fingers. Several times during meal times, playtimes, and even outings, you talked about not understanding what she wants and that you want her to use words to be able to understand her. When other kids are at school, that time goes well, but it might be better if Kendra could entertain herself with toys a little bit longer or even pretend with toys. When you're out, Kendra likes that, but she gets upset. If the stroller is not moving, leaving the park is difficult. Dinner time goes well. So you get a sense here, hopefully, of how the recap is done. It's highlighting the things that the family mentioned that sound like they might be concerned, and they're stated around the routines that you talked about. One of the cautions with the recap is making sure that the recap doesn't become a whole other interview. The recap should be relatively short and generally doesn't invite a whole lot more dialogue. Of course, if the family has something to contribute or add to it, we're going to pause for that. Otherwise, it's kind of just a quick little review of what it is that we talked about. And then we invite families to something along the lines of, now please tell me of these concerns or anything else. What are the things that you would like to be on the list of things that we're going to turn into outcomes to work on? This recap part is important. As you go through and you're asking the family what they want to work on, you might also provide some cueing. You know, the family might say, well, for sure I want her to be able to tell me what it is that she wants, and that came at meal times, playtimes, and outings. So we'll write that down. You might prompt the family as well, and you can show them the notes that, you know, another thing that you mentioned was, we talked quite a bit about it, was that when you're out and about, that she gets really upset when the stroller is not moving. So you can prompt the family as well. And again, the family is choosing what they want to work on. You're not choosing what the family wants to work on. The family then selects their priorities, and it might go something like, that was the remainder of what you talked about. Now what would you like the team to work on? Include the things for anyone. Again, the outcomes don't have to be just for the child. They may be for the family. They might even be for other family members. You're going to use that blank piece of paper, or you can use the family concerns and priorities page of the IFSP. You'll write down the routine. I think we talked about these pieces. Focus on those starred or highlighted items. Generally, you're going to have about 6 to 10 priorities that the family wants to work on that will become IFSP outcomes. I know sometimes there's been some question about, wow, that's a lot of outcomes. And when you think about it, these are outcomes that are much more specific. They're tied to routines. These are the outcomes that are really going to be used to guide your intervention visit. So when you get started in working with the family, you'll be talking about each of the outcomes. Here is the family concerns and priorities page. This is where you're going to document what is it that the family wants to work on from the routine-based interview. You've got here the desires. You've got what's happening now. I just want to show that this is cross-referenced with the family prioritizes these. So you're going to have a list here, and they're going to prioritize what it is that they want to work on. The other thing that's going to happen is you're going to cross-reference those priorities with outcomes. Let me share with you an example of what that might look like as a completed one. So here is what it is that the family wants to work on that came up during the routine-based interview. Then the family was asked to put them in priority order. One way that this is done is to ask, okay, here's the things you want to work on. We talked a little bit about what's happening now. If we could only work on one of these, which one would it be? We're going to have time to work on all of them, but if we could only work on one, which would it be? And they go ahead and write that, a 1 there, and then they go ahead and rank order the rest of them. Then what we do is we take this information to begin to write our IFSP outcome. So this is the cross-reference. So outcome 1 is related to priority 1. The reason it's cross-referenced here is that sometimes an outcome a priority that the family has might be broken down into 2 outcomes. Sometimes you might have 2 priorities that could be collapsed into 1 outcome. It doesn't happen often, but this cross-referencing allows for that in the event that it's needed. I just want to highlight you here for you on page 43 of the handbook is a crib sheet, and this looks at the structure of the routine-based interview. So we talked about the purpose, we talked about offering those insurances, the amount of time. It goes through those 6 pieces that you talk about during each of the activities during the day. There's the thinking questions, the worry and change questions, the recap, letting parents take notes, review the notes, identify what the family wants to work on, and then asking the family to prioritize. A question is there a requirement to have a minimum of 6 outcomes? It's not a requirement to have a minimum of 6 outcomes, but one of the things that you'll see in Robin's work with the routine-based interview, it is a bit of a quality measure of looking at the richness of what's gathered in a routine-based interview. Generally, a good, rich, routine-based interview will result in 6 to 10 outcomes. It might be that you have 5 outcomes. It might be that you have 4. But generally, you're going to have around about 6 to 10. So again, it is one marker. It's not the only marker, but it is a marker of did we gather good, rich information about the child and the family within the context of the different routines and activities that they're that they do on a regular basis. I want to highlight another resource for you. I know we're getting really close to our time up. This is another resource. This is from Siskin Institute where Robin is at, and there's a host of other resources that are there. I strongly do encourage you to take a look at some of the resources that are there. This is the RBI implementation checklist that you can download, and it highlights many of the key elements that are in the routine-based interview. Again, as we look at the routine-based interview and embedding it into the EDIS IFSP process, we do want to stay close to the fidelity of the routine-based interview as opposed to a variety of different hybrid models. Certainly, as you've heard from a couple of folks here today, as you get started with the routine-based interview, I think you'll certainly see how it is a great tool for identifying what it is the family wants to work on, and that's what we want in early intervention. It's a great tool for continuing to build that relationship and understanding what's going well, what's not going well, in order to work in partnership with families to address the priorities that they have for their families. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions. I see there's some questions going on in the chat box, and again, I strongly encourage that. One of the things that I will share with you, if it's possible, actually, when you go to the Siskin Institute website, you're going to see a host of other resources associated with the routine-based interview that I think will help you in terms of just to get an idea of some of the different types of outcomes. But the different types of outcomes are going to be unique to every single individual family. So being sensitive to time, what I would like to do is, Jane, can we open up the poll question, the feedback poll question about today's webinar?
Yes, I'm going to create a new share for that because it wasn't included in the slide deck, so bear with me one moment.
Okay. So as Jane is doing that, and there continues to be some questions in the chat box, which again I strongly encourage, I do want to highlight that, again, the next webinars are going to be in January, the 7th on Tuesday, on the 9th on Thursday. We're going to continue looking at the IFSP process. The next one that we're going to do in January, we're going to take a closer look. I saw that there were several questions about the PLOD today. We're going to take a look at the PLOD. We're also going to take a look at child outcome summary process. So stay tuned for that next week. Hopefully we'll be able to address some of your PLOD questions. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to direct them to my email here, or if there are questions specific to the system requirements, please refer those on to Military OneSource. And Jane, here you see the final poll question about today's webinar. Please do take a moment and respond to this 5-point scale about the usefulness of today's webinar. That's going to be helpful for us as we move along. Okay, some great discussion here in the chat about different types of outcomes and things like that. We'll be sharing some more resources along that line as well, but please, I strongly encourage you to share these ideas back and forth. It's nice to see the chat going. Yeah, I think what we see with the routines-based interview is every single family's mix of outcomes is going to be unique to their particular family and their particular child and their interests, which is a huge value of the routines-based interview, to be able to really tailor outcomes to what the family wants to work on with early intervention services. I believe one of the resources that you'll find at the Siskin Institute website that we shared, or that's on your slide deck, is a list of different types of outcomes, not to say, not to be used as a menu of possible outcomes, but more to be used as a resource of different ways to write outcomes that are really functional and tied to family routines and activities. So take a look for that as well. I think there's some more folks that need to respond to the poll question. I see some people are starting to sign off on the webinar, so please take a moment to complete the poll that's on the screen now. That's going to be helpful for us again as we move forward. There's a few more folks adding to the chat, which is great. I didn't see the question about RBI requiring certification before. Linda just sent me a little chat on that. What we want to make sure is that everybody has good background and training on the routines-based interview. It is not required that folks have specific training there, but you certainly need to know what are the key components, and have some opportunities for practice and certainly some opportunities for feedback on the routines-based interview. One of the things that we've implemented is that folks, in order to demonstrate understanding, is to turn in a routines-based interview that they completed and get feedback on that. So we want to make sure that people understand what are the elements of the routines-based interview, and also to make sure that we can build confidence and competence in doing it, along with learning from each other through the process. The poll questions are working. The results are not being broadcast the way this particular poll is set up. So please go ahead and enter your response to the poll. You're not going to see the feedback on it just because this one is set up, I guess, a little bit differently. So please go ahead and click on the poll response, even though you're not going to see your response sign up or show up on the screen. Yes, down the road, we're certainly looking for more specific training on the routines-based interview. What we did today was just scratch the surface. I strongly encourage you to take a look at the IFSP handbook. We're going to look at some possible ways to share some additional video and resources on the routines-based interview. Absolutely. So take a minute to do the poll, and I would like to wish everybody happy holidays, and I certainly do look forward to seeing you all in January as we're continuing our webinar series. And again, I would like to open it up. If anybody has questions about the standardization or the implementation or steps in the process, or would like to contribute more to the webinars, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. So with that, I would like to encourage you to continue to chat if you so desire, but also recognize that our time is over, and wish you all happy holidays and look forward to seeing you in January.
Dr. Youngren, thank you so much. I'm not sure if did you want to allow anybody, well, I guess at this time too, anybody who'd like to ask a verbal question can also hit *2 if they'd like to chat with Naomi briefly. We'll stay on the line for a few more moments. But just to remind folks that the files are available in the upper right-hand corner there, all of the worksheets that were referenced today, along with the slide deck from today's session, as well as the slide deck from the previous session last week. And that email was distributed as well. And we'll work on getting you a link to the video so you can watch it. So we will stay on the line for a few more minutes in case anybody has a question. *2 will take your line off of mute, but have a great rest of your day and rest of your week, and we will see you in January. Thanks so much, everybody.